Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Teaching with Primary Sources webinar. We're very thrilled to have you join us. My name is Dr. Tina Ellsworth, and I'm an assistant professor of education at Northwest Missouri State University, and I'm also the director of the Teaching with Primary Sources program at Northwest Missouri State University. Joining us today is my assistant director of the Teaching with Primary Sources program, Dr. Scott Waring, a professor of social studies education at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Teaching with Primary Sources is a funded program from a grant from the Library of Congress and their Teaching with Primary Sources program. So content created, featured in partnership with TPS program does not indicate an endorsement by the library, but we are so grateful to have received support from them to make these programs available. The program runs October 1 to September 30 of 2025. It features 3 two-day face-to-face workshops for pre-K through 16 educators. And our first one was in Maryville, Missouri in December of 2024. Our second was in Topeka, Kansas in January of this year. And our last one just finished up in early April in Platte City, Missouri. Teachers receive a stipend for their participation in the workshop, as well as creating lessons that feature sources from the Library of Congress. At our workshop, teachers learned a new host of ways to teach with primary sources in new and engaging ways. So our program also features webinars with expert educators, and we have an incredible program that we've been able to put on so far. In February, we heard from Dr. Alyssa Ford, a professor of history at Northwest Missouri State University, where she taught us about how to teach through a local lens using sources from the Library of Congress. About a month later, on March 17th, fifth grade teacher from Olathe, Kansas, Rachel Swearingen, taught us how to bring rural histories to life by using picture books and primary source investigations. Then on April 7th, we heard from Valencia Abbott, a high school social studies teacher from North Carolina, who told us about history in our own backyard and how to amplify rural histories through inquiry and primary sources. And tonight, we are lucky to have with us Rory Dunn, a Ph.D. candidate at Virginia Commonwealth University, who's going to talk to us about ethics, access, and historical thinking, conducting oral history work with students in rural communities. You can sign up for all of our webinars, even though this is the last one for this year, but you can sign up for them by going to our website, which I will put in the chat here in a minute. All of our webinars are free and open to the public. And then as you can see here, we're recording this one, and all past webinars will be on our YouTube channel. But we also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to get the earliest information about our upcoming events, as well as tips for teaching with primary sources. That's using the QR code you see in front of you right now. So if you want to grab it, take a picture of it, and go straight to the link and sign up to get first access via our newsletter, we would love to have you join us. So, as we said earlier tonight, the fourth webinar in our series for this year, featuring Mr. Rory Dunn, a PhD student from Virginia Commonwealth University. Before we tell you a little bit more about him, we want to hear from you. So who are you and what drew you to our webinar tonight? I want to go ahead and start with this one. So obviously I'm the director of this program, but I specifically called Rory because I had heard about the work that he was doing with his research in rural America. And I was really intrigued by the work that he's done with some of our partners in the TPS program. So I don't want to steal too much of his thunder. So I'm going to let him talk to you about that a little bit. So it was really important to me that we got him here for that reason. So that's part of the reason why I'm here tonight. I wanted to hear him talk. But now we want to hear from the other folks that are on the call. Why are you here? Who are you? Where do you teach, and what drew you to the webinar tonight? Don't want to put anybody on the spot. You don't want to share. Well, we are pleased that all of you have joined us tonight. And as mentioned earlier, one aspect to our program is to offer webinars to help teachers learn more about teaching with primary sources. And so tonight, we are pleased to present to a brilliant educator who's done incredible work with engaging students with inquiry and primary sources. And tonight, Rory is going to be presenting about ethics, access, and historical thinking, conducting oral history work with students in rural communities. He is a PhD candidate, as I mentioned earlier, at the Virginia Commonwealth University. He holds a master's degree in history from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, an MA in education from the College of William and Mary, He's taught social studies methods courses in higher ed and is a former K-12 social studies teacher. He has a passion for connecting oral history work with students and has previously worked with the National Council for History Ed in providing meaningful professional development for rural social studies teachers. And his research interests include theory and practice and critical historical inquiry and empowering rural social studies teachers and students to engage in meaningful historical research and inquiry. So everyone, please help me welcome Rory Dunn.
Hey everyone, small crew today, but I recognize some people. Hey Annie, it's been a minute. I think it was NCHE, but it's good to see you here. Can we hear me all right? Is there some lag or are we doing all right? Great. All right, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go ahead and get started. And thank you for joining me on Cinco de Mayo. I recognize that we could be having fun, and you're joining me here. All right, so I want to just start with this image on the first title page about ethics, access, and historical thinking. So this is a picture that's actually from right adjacent to a community where I taught, Prince Edward County. I did some oral history work here, and I want to share this image because a lot of amazing oral history work has happened in this county. For those who are not terribly familiar with Virginia history, there was a period of time known as massive resistance, where Virginia resisted integration following Brown versus Board of Education. And this county was infamous for closing its school doors for 5 whole years. So no public school for 5 whole years. And I taught in the community adjacent to this. I taught families who were affected by this, and using oral history to kind of connect to this history was very empowering for me as an educator. And I felt like it made a big difference for my students. But before we go any further, I wanted to talk about our agenda. You know, as a former, you can't kill the former K-12 teacher in me. So we're going to talk about this concept of rurality. What does it mean to be rural? And how this obscures our understanding of rural spaces in both the past and the present. We'll talk about oral history, what it is, you know, why do we practice it? What does it add to our understanding of history? And we'll discuss ethics and oral history work in vulnerable communities, because as many of you know, rural communities have vulnerable populations, people that are on the lower end of the socioeconomic status, minority groups, people that have been affected in the past by historical trauma. And so engaging in these spaces requires a delicate hand. And then we'll talk about some practical considerations for doing oral history work with students, because it is difficult to wrangle a bunch of kids to collect oral histories. That is hard work. And so we're going to leave with some practical guidelines for how to tackle that. And lastly, we'll end the session with questions that you guys have. But I want to start first with this question, and I think this is a really hard question that people are struggling to answer. And I think I want to hear from you about what does it mean to be rural? And we have just few enough of us that we don't have to do the word cloud. But if you would want to type in the chat one word, just take a second, think about one word that you would use to describe rural. And if you could throw that in the chat for me, I would greatly appreciate it. So one word you would use to describe what rural means. Okay, underdeveloped areas, country, not big building, diversity. Nice. Low population. Yeah. If you see me staring off to the, I have a second monitor here. I'm not like telepathically absorbing, these responses. Farms, windmills. Yeah, excellent. These are, we're engaging with a lot of the imagery that people associate with rural spaces. So thank you for contributing. That was a great exercise, and I think it reveals a lot of what we immediately leap to when we think of rural spaces. Stereotype conservative, yeah, absolutely. So what obscures our historical understanding of rural spaces? And this is a question that I want to return to. And I think perhaps the most obvious one for social studies educators is what we have to teach about rural spaces, right? What we have to teach about rural history. And so we're going to look first at how do social studies standards characterized rural spaces. And so we're going to do a little exercise. I'm going to show you a standard from a state that talks about rural America. And I want you to think about how it characterizes rural space and type that in the chat for me as we go along. So take a few minutes, read the standard, think about how does this standard characterize rural space and the rural past, and type it in the chat for me. So this is from Wisconsin. This is a geography strand. Take a few minutes, read, type your reaction in the chat for me. We've got urbanization is good. It's more advanced. Rural focus on decline. Yeah, good eye. So I don't know if you noticed this, but on the left-hand side, we have cities that are being balanced with both positive and negative factors. But if you look on the right, rural spaces only get decline. So they don't talk about any of there's no summarize the positive factors of being in rural space. It's only think about the decline of rural spaces as a reaction to the growth in cities. Here's Virginia. Take a second. So this is a seventh grade standard for Virginia. What do we notice about this particular strand? Rural areas don't have anything to contribute. Yeah, why do rural areas have to be considered neglected? That's a really strange word to have in a standard, isn't it? This idea, because neglect, that that assumes that there's someone doing the neglecting. And in this standard about bringing progress into rural spaces, who is the neglector here? So that's some strange framing. Here's another. Nice, Sandy. Yeah, not much has changed since the Civil War. We have this idea of industrialization, but also what's happening to rural spaces in this narrative that is being told by this standard. Again, yeah, there's this idea that farms are responding to industrialization, not evolving in concert. It's not a driver of change, it's a response. Yeah, it is pretty interesting. Um, I think it's quite interesting that they only mention one, blacks and whites leaving from rural regions to urban centers. And we know that the rural South is more diverse than that. But beyond that, it completely omits this very well recorded phenomenon of rural to rural migration, right? Of people leaving the rural South and going to rural spaces elsewhere. It's not just this simplistic migration from South to North. And the last one that I'm gonna torture you with, this is from New York. And then I will let you guys rest because you've been amazing workers for me. So what do we notice about this collection of New York standards? This is their 9 through 12 social studies standards. Different pages. Yeah, rural people are unskilled. That seems to be the implicit messaging here. Right? We have on one hand, they're saying, okay, rural spaces, they're traditional, they're agrarian. And then as society progresses, we become secular, urban, and industrial. And then on the other hand, they're talking about how we've evolved from an agrarian to an industrial and then to an information economy. And now the workers are highly skilled and educated. And I guarantee if you go talk to a farmer and you tell them they're unskilled, they're probably going to laugh at your face, right? That's hard work. It requires a very specific set of skills. So why are we seeing these deficit narratives and about the rural past? It's perplexing. Well, some scholars they say, hey, this is something called urban normativity, which is a fancy way of saying what our society is structured around urban culture, about urban ways of thinking, about urban knowledges, often at the expense of rural spaces, of rural people, and rural identities. And if you want to read more about this, this is a great book called Critical Rural Theory, the other CRT, um, and it talks about this relationship. Um, but it's not just standards, I think, that influence the way that we think about the rural past, right? There's this other component. So I'm going to return to this question of what obscures our historical understanding of rural spaces. And I think the one thing, like if you ask any person on the street to describe a rural place, they might use stereotypes to do that description. And so there are historical versions of these stereotypes that extend into the past as well. And so we're going to do some exploration of these historical stereotypes. And before we get there, I just want to talk about, so why do we use stereotypes as a species? And I think there are many reasons. Two that I want to point out are one, they're useful, right? We use stereotypes because they simplify things. They simplify things. They simplify our understanding. They streamline decision-making processes. But on the other hand, they can be used as tools to oppress people, right? If you can control who creates the stereotype, if you can control what the stereotype says, then you can have a lot of power about influencing how people think about other groups. So we're going to look at some historical stereotypes here. So these are some of my favorite sources from the Library of Congress. These are from the Federal Theater Project. And so the Federal Theater Project, for those that don't know, is it's a WPA project, a Works Progress Administration project. It was used to employ struggling artists, musicians, actors during the Great Depression. And they also had set designers do some of this work. So this is a costume design piece from the Federal Theater Project. And I want you to see if you can identify some stereotypes that are being employed here in 1934 about rural people. So what do you guys see that perhaps is stereotypical that might ring through to today? White, yes, overalls, farmers, the hillbilly, yes, absolutely. Plaid shirts, yeah. Got the beards. And then what's he wearing on his neck? It's not just a bandana. It's a red neck kerchief. A red neck kerchief, which is a very curious thing. All right, what about this one? Same program. What do we see? What do we see in this costume design? Yeah, ironic. Yeah, bandanas. Some might associate them with the Indians. Got suspenders. Anyone here like fishing? What's he got around his legs? Beard, tin cup. Yep. Dirty. By the way, this performance was put on in Brooklyn, so it was in Brooklyn. Yeah, he's made his own waiters. And one last one from this set. One last one from this set. What do we see here? That might be a stereotype. Yeah, he's been drinking. He's been drinking. So we've got a whole gamut of stereotypes about rural people here. Dirty, perhaps uneducated, drinking moonshine, whiskey, the whole gamut. Now, the reason I wanted to spend time to point out the redneck here is because I'm sure all of you have heard the colloquial term redneck. What's a redneck? Lay it out for me. What's a redneck? Based on your understanding, what is a redneck? Just a farmer?
I think where I am, you hear a lot of people use it to mean a white farmer who might have their body completely covered with clothing except for the back of their neck. So they get
Okay.
sunburned on the back of their neck.
So there's a racial element. They're white, they're a farmer, and they're well clothed except for the neck. They got the sunburn on the neck. That's a very stereotypical trope that you hear about rednecks. Uneducated, and he's saying uneducated people works in the farm, the neck, the perpetual sunburn. Person who works in the fields, when he went to the town, he has a red neck. That's kind of the stereotype of the myth. That term, however, can be linked to a number of different origins, and one of them comes from this particular battle called the Battle of Blair Mountain. And if you've never heard of this battle, it's a fascinating time. It was the second largest insurrection in American history. So about 5,000 miners that were attempting to strike ended up doing battle with U.S. forces. And they were quite heavily armed. I mean, they had a machine gun that you can see in this image up here, and they were well armed, and people died. And so one of the terms that comes out of this conflict is the redneck, right? The redneck. And so we have this fabulous oral history snippet from the Library of Congress about the origin of the term redneck. And so what they say, this is Joe Aleph, who's a descendant of one of these people. He says, that's where the term redneck comes from. He says, how so? Well, he said, well, our men had no uniforms. Everybody tied a red bandana around their neck. And that's the way you figured out who was on your side and who wasn't. You didn't shoot the people wearing the red bandanas. And so that's why a lot of people wear the redneck bandanas today. So there's this a little bit of labor history to complicate that term of redneck that we see used quite a bit. Now, stereotypes aren't just negative, right? We also have positive stereotyping. So these are some of my favorite images as well. These are about the Grange movement, which if you've never heard of, the Grange movement is a period in U.S. history after the Civil War, after the financial panic of 1873. And what happens is rural farmers really struggled because of the price explosions for shipping their goods on trains. And so we see this movement where a populist movement where farmers are trying to advocate for themselves. And so they portray themselves in a very different light, right? They're trying to counteract some of these stereotypes, maybe, of rural places. And so what do you notice about how this person is depicted and how rural life is depicted in these images, in these lithographs?
My first impression was actually how he looked like he was dressed as a statesman of the field. You know, he's standing upright, even though he's on his field. He
Yeah.
has everything around him to show his opulence and the fact that you can't call me stupid because I am educated. That's just my first impression.
Yeah, he seems like a very confident person. He's dressed really well. Um, and the scene behind him is pretty bucolic, right? It seems like almost like a romanticized view of what it is to be a farmer. And we've got these kind of big concepts underneath them: faith, hope, charity, fidelity, these like noble concepts. And some might say this is, if you're familiar with U.S. history and Thomas Jefferson, you might have heard of the term yeoman farmer. So that was this idea that farmers were enlightened, that farmers were the spiritual core of the nation, that they were doing moral work by working in the fields. And so that very much so embodies that kind of spirituality and that relationship with the land. And then I like this one even more. This guy looks so suave. Look at this, the deep cut red shirt, and he's aggressively saying, "I feed you all." The world, so kind of revolves around him.
If
Uh,
anyone has read the Little House on the Prairie series, this reminds me of the father and how he was able to bring things to town because, in the 4th of July. I mean, this is way back, but if you ever read the entire series, that is him standing next to his horses.
mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. And these stereotypes, these positive stereotypes, but stereotypes nonetheless of rural space are really, really old. For example, this is an engraving from 100 years before this. So the nation was just brand new. and we have this is from a magazine, and you'll notice a lot of very similar imagery. There's almost like a spiritual element to the farming here. There's this bucolic scene. They have the term "venerate the plow." So these images are as old as the nation itself, and they affect how we think about rural spaces. And so, as history teachers, we recognize that history is way more complex and valuable than these stereotypes, than these standards are portraying. But the question is, how do we access these histories? Because it's a problem of access. Accessing rural histories is hard. Communities are often very small. Communities have there's less history that's going to be present in state standards. There's a lack of history infrastructure that really prohibits access. So there's not like there's usually in really, really small counties, they might not have a local history society. They probably don't have an archive you can go to. There's not a museum that you can go to, right? So these are places people usually go when they want to access local narratives. I know you guys had someone talk about newspapers. Well, a lot of rural communities, they might not have had a local newspaper, or their local newspaper hasn't been digitized. So you can't access those records. So it's really, really hard to kind of tap into these diverse settings. But one thing that you can do, at least for present history, right, history that's close to us, is you can use oral history to help you access rural narratives. And so that's what I'm going to argue, is that oral history is a great thing for you to incorporate in your classroom. My argument is going to start with a brief review of some national survey work. So if you haven't read these, I highly recommend that you do so as a person that works in social studies. One is older, The Presence of the Past. That's an old book. It was published in the 90s. And it had survey data, a national survey data from the 90s. But this recent one, History, the Past, and Public Culture, was sponsored by the American Historical Association, Pete Burkholder and Dana Schaefer. They replicated that study in modern times. And so tells us a lot about how people in our nation think about the past. And I want to show you why I think oral history is a great solution for some of the problems you're going to see here. So here is from the most recent iteration of this survey. And I want you to notice an astonishing 66% of the people they polled, which is a big survey, 1,500 people, said that history was just names, dates, and facts about the past. That's it. Names, dates, and facts about the past. Only 17% said that history was an explanation of experiences in the past. This idea that it is an explanation of the past, that it is constructed, right? If you think that history is just name, dates, and facts, there is no construction, it is objective. But if you think about history as an explanation of the past, you start thinking about things like authorship and contextualization and sourcing and all those historical thinking skills that we want to have our students engage with. Now, here is from the Rory Rosenweig study. They asked survey participants to indicate on a scale of 1 to 10 how connected to the past they felt in a variety of settings where they might engage in a study of the past. You'll notice the highest score was gatherings with the family, where people tell stories about the past, visiting history museums or historic sites, and celebrating a holiday. And at the very bottom of this list, studying in history in school with a mean score of 5.7. So we have our work cut out for us, right? To engage people in the study in the past. If people aren't feeling connected, that's a problem. And then this one is the most astonishing, which is trust in sources, trust in the accuracy of the narrative that's being provided. And so what you'll notice is eyewitnesses are really, they are trusted quite a bit by the majority of people in this survey. 64%, 64% said, hey, oh no, I had a pop-up and I moved from my screen. All right, 64% of people said, hey, eyewitnesses, I trust those a lot. History teachers, not so much. 36% of people said they trusted them. 55% said, I don't know about these people. And 9% were like, absolutely not. I don't trust them at all. So that's a pretty stark difference, right? And so oral history is a solution to these problems. One, because it can help our students engage in the study of history because they are investigating their own communities. They're engaging with eyewitnesses about the past that apparently Americans trust more than history teachers. Two, oral history employs different strategies to understanding the past and can help students understand the constructed nature of history. When you're talking to someone about the past, the fallibility of memory is really obvious. They're going to be like, oh man, was it 5 or 6 years ago? And was I talking to this person or that person? And students pick up on that. They're like, oh wow, this guy is like trying to remember stuff, and I'm not sure if he's got it all together, right? So we start to see those fissures in this idea that history is completely objective. And lastly, having students do oral history work is an amazing tool to build communication skills like active listening and socio-emotional skills like empathy, because they're engaging, they're listening to human stories from people in their communities that have suffered and lived through real trials. And so I think this is, I don't want to say it's a panacea, but it is amazing for connecting students to the study of history. All right, so that's my pitch. So let's talk about what makes oral history what it is. What makes it distinctive from, let's say, a more traditional form of studying the past. One, oral history is unique because it is adjacent to the present. And this is, when you think about it, this is really strange for people that study history. For most of our careers as students, we are engaging with the far distant past. We are being asked to imagine history and context and culture from a very specific time period with different morals, with, you know, we're having to comprehend kind of this strange world that's very different from the present. But oral history, that is adjacent to the present. You can touch it. You can feel how close it is to the present. And that gives it power effectively, but it also makes things complex, right? Having students kind of think about, oh man, this is pretty close. It was kind of different, but not really. And those through lines start to blur. Oral history is unique because it is filtered through personal and social context. And when I mean unique, all history is filtered through personal and social context, but oral history is unique by how blatant it is, right? When you're reading a textbook about the past, you're not thinking about the textbook author as a unique person and how their experiences are influencing the production of that history. But when you're talking to someone about their lived experience and they're telling you a story, you might start thinking, hey, what is this guy trying to spin? What is he trying to hide? What is he, you start asking these questions about motive, which are important for students to recognize. And lastly, and this is the most important part, oral history is unique because it is co-constructed. And this is something that's almost truly novel for history work that does this. Normally, students are removed from the creation of history, right? They are processing and reading products from the distant past. But now they are thinking, they're engaging, they're in the room in the construction of that history, and they're thinking about what is my presence doing to the creation of this narrative. So if you're a white dude and you're interviewing somebody about the civil rights movement, that's an added element that affects the creation of the narrative, right? So that element of co-construction is really, really integral to oral history. Now, I want to stress a few things. Oral history is not folklore. It is not gossip. It isn't hearsay, and it isn't rumor. Even though you're honoring stories and you're listening to people as they convey their experiences, you still have to verify the information. You have to corroborate the source material that you're collecting, and that's just an important part. Now, the big difference, though, is that fact checking, that corroboration doesn't necessarily occur during the interview period, which is a lesson that some students sometimes have to learn. So if someone says an erroneous date, you're not going to be like, "Hey, you said the erroneous date, and now I'm going to get in your face about it." No, you do the fact checking later, but it is an important part, right? We don't take what people say at face value. And so the last bit, not the last bit, but the next bit that I want to talk about is the ethics of conducting oral history and what you should do in rural spaces. So we'll talk about four things. The first is something called informed consent. The second is a mindset shift, which is a mindset shift from extraction to participation. We'll talk about how to do oral history with vulnerable populations and what historical trauma, how historical trauma can affect how willing people are going to talk about minority groups, or sorry, how willing people are going to talk about their trauma in the past. And then lastly, I'll list some best practices. Can you hear my dog losing his mind right now? I'm very sorry. A little bit. Sorry. All right. So these are resources that I prepared for you that you can use in your own classrooms. And so what I'd like, you can go to this QR code and it'll take you to a page and it'll ask you to copy it, and you can keep this for yourself. I'm also going to paste the link in the chat if you want to use it. All right, so the link's in the chat. This is a link to an informed consent document. So what I recommend for people that are beginning to do oral history work with their students is when you engage with participants, you give them this form. And this form should spell out a few things very explicitly. They should describe your project in a paragraph. They should describe what an oral history is. They should talk about voluntary participation. This idea that if your participant gets uncomfortable or says they don't want to continue the oral history, they can revoke their oral history from your project at any point, right? That's at any point in the project they can step aside. That should be allowed. And lastly, and this is a really important point, in oral history, it's not confidential, right? We are adding to the historical record, and so people's names are used in oral history transcripts, and that can be a really scary thing because what you say can have consequences. But and so wrapping your head around, getting students to wrap their heads around this can be difficult. But informed consent, this one sheet should help you if you want to start doing this work with you can just copy and paste the description of your project and get the ball rolling. Two is a mindset shift, and this is hard for students. Normally, when we're working with the past, when we're working with historical documents, we have this extraction mindset, right? We're thinking, okay, who is this person? What is their intent with this document? How can I extract information from this document about the past? But when you're conducting oral history, you have to shift your mindset, right? It's an exercise in shared power between the participant and the interviewer, between the participant and the interviewer. This idea that you are working together to construct the narrative. And so it's important to recall that the interview is co-constructed, that there are going to be inaccuracies, and there will be inaccuracies, but you have to consider the time and the place to refute them. And always, you have to put person first, not the data, when you're collecting these histories. Because if you go in with the data mindset, you're going to miss, one, some of the human elements of the storytelling, but you're also going to start slipping into that extraction mindset. And this is especially important as you conduct oral histories with vulnerable populations. And so as we know, a lot of rural communities have vulnerable populations. They tend to be lower on the socioeconomic scale. There's people of great diversity in rural spaces that have different and varying levels of power. And there's a lot of historical trauma in some of these communities. And two books that I would recommend that you read was one, Death in the Promised Land. It's about the Tulsa Race Massacre, Tulsa Race Riot. And it talks about silence that occurs after this event. People just refused to talk about what happened. And that's a very typical reaction when there's been a great harm in a community in the historical past. And we see this again. So this is Eva Hoffman's book. She was collecting oral history interviews from second generation Holocaust survivors. And so she was talking to, their sons, their daughters, and they were recalling a very similar thing about this historical trauma, right? That there was this pervasive silence about the thing in the past. And this is something that is difficult to get around when you're collecting oral history about sensitive topics like the civil rights movement, where you're collecting sensitive information about, economic downturn in a particular place, right? People's livelihoods are really closely linked to their emotional well-being. And so this is a quote from the Eva Hoffman book I'd like to share. She says, but the general silence on the subject, the lack of interest, meant that in families, the secret past became even more of a secret, that the different kind of silence prevailing among survivors became reinforced, that the children, as they were growing up, were thrown into greater confusion and emotional isolation. So this idea of historical silence as a result of trauma is important for oral history because you will sooner or later stumble upon a sensitive subject that people don't want to talk about for whatever reason. And so, to give you an example, when I was conducting oral histories in Prince Edward County with my students, we encountered this quite a bit. To give you some background, so this is the Moton School, or Mary E. Bridge School on the left. It was a tar paper school. This is the black school in the county. And it was part of the lawsuit that joined Brown versus Board of Education in the initial lawsuit to get rid of segregation. And so you'll notice that the structure itself wasn't very nice. When I talked to people about this, they said, "Oh yeah, when it rained, it would rain inside the building. When it was cold, you could feel it through your bones. There were like furnaces inside the classrooms." And they had the fold-out chairs for their auditorium. So they would take all the fold-out chairs and put them out as they sat down. And this is also where they ate lunch. And so this is the white school, the Worsham School. And so on the left, you'll notice it's got a brick facade, looks pretty fancy, got some nice windows. Definitely looks like it's not gonna leak. That looks like a slate roof to me. And then on the right here, we have the auditorium. And so they've got, these fancy fixed seats, and so on and so forth. So there's, this clear disparity. Well, after they won the case, we entered massive resistance, right? Where they shut down the public school for 5 years. And so I interviewed somebody with my students, a woman by the name of Rita Mosley. And she said this about the school that she used to attend. She said, "So once I saw the large chains and the huge lock on the door of the school, I knew it was closed. I had to pass that and see that almost daily because someone wouldn't send us to the store. If someone sent us to the store or something, my mother, my grandmother, and we had to buy groceries. So we had to pass the school that was chained shut all the time." And to add insult to injury, she told us that they actually removed the playground equipment at the school. So children couldn't go and play on the playground. So that's a pretty severe historical trauma, right? This young woman, she was sent to Blacksburg, which is like a 5-hour drive from this county, to live for 3 years. She didn't see her mother for 3 years as a fifth grader in a new city to go to school. So that's the kind of stuff that people were living through in this really rural community. And she refused to talk about it with her kids. She wouldn't do it. And so we went and we actually talked to, I talked to her son, Frank Mosley II. And so we talked about that silence. And he said it wasn't just my mom that was silent about it. It was everybody. He said it wasn't something that was really celebrated or, brought up during Black History Month. He said we didn't talk about it in the history classes. And he said the reason they did that was because it was embarrassment. People in the community were embarrassed to talk about it because they got pushback and then it made them look bad politically. And so in rural communities, which are really tight knit, when a trauma occurs, it is really hard to get past that silence. Really, really hard. And so we have some best practices to kind of ameliorate this process of collecting history in the past. One is this idea that the stories that are shared have consequences for those that live there. And so it's really important that you check with your participants about what they are comfortable sharing. Be transparent with them. And so this is often built into that one sheet that you hand them. You tell them exactly what you're going to do with the information from the outset. You tell them to your face, you read the document, you go over it with them. Super important. 2, transcripts from oral interviews should always be reviewed by participants after the fact. And so they're allowed to remove whatever they want from the record. Now, oral historians and other people call that member checking, right? If you're in the social sciences, they probably call it the same thing, member checking. This idea that the person that you're interviewing, they have to be able to review and give the star of approval on that transcript. And another one that might not be obvious is that you need to avoid third-party transcription. And what I mean by that is like we're seeing, especially right now, a surge in a lot of AI technology that says they're gonna, transcribe your whatever audio files. These are really dangerous because you don't know who has background access. So if you're working with a sensitive population, for example, a rural community that has suffered a historical trauma, and you're using AI to transcribe that, then there's a chance that they're using it, one, to either feed their algorithm or they're selling that data to somebody, and it's a confidentiality nightmare. And lastly, and this is very important, oral histories are meant to be shared, right? But not all participants are comfortable with the methods of sharing. And so one thing that you have to discuss with your participants is how you're going to disseminate that information. Is it going in an archive? Are you going to have a gallery where students and participants can come together and interact with it? So all steps of that process need to be very transparent. And we've come to the last section, which is practical considerations of doing oral history work with students. And so I have a few things that I want to talk about. The first is, one, preparing students to do interviews, which is a lot harder than it sounds. Two, how do you carve out instructional time to do this work with students? And if you don't have time to do this work with students, how can you incorporate oral history work? Three, transcription work with students, which is very interesting and very painful for them. And four, having them build trust with participants. And this is a beautiful thing, is watching your students engage with the community. All right, so those are the four things that we'll talk about in this subsection. And so I have another thing for you. I've used this when I do oral history work with students. It's best not to just come up cold with your own interview questions. It's good to start from a template. And so what I have for you, and which I'll pop in the chat, is an adapted life history document. An adapted life history document. And so life history is a type of oral history, right? It goes over the entire life of the participant, usually from early childhood to the present. You can chunk this, right? So if you're interested in maybe that participant's adolescence, you can use only questions from the adolescence. If you're interested about their schooling experiences, you can ask them questions about their schooling. But this document is a list of 60 or 70 questions that you can use to get the ball rolling with your students. Now, what I recommend is when you're working with your students, you grab like five questions, and then you workshop them with your students to make them specific to the context that you're working on. But at least you have, with this document, somewhere to start with. And this comes from UCLA's Oral History Center. They have a fantastic, very robust oral history center that does a lot of training and a lot of production of oral history. So I recommend that you check out their resources as well. And the key for interviewing with students is practice, right? So when I do oral history work with my students, I always do a few practice rounds. They interview their parents, they interview their friends, and they have to record it. And we used to have concerns about the recording device, the fidelity of the recording device. But everyone has cell phones these days that have pretty good recorders, so you can just use your cell phone. But have your students record an interview with each other or a trusted family member. And as they come to class, you talk about common mistakes that crop up in these interviews. And a few that I've seen over the years that I've taught oral history work is, one, students sticking too intensely to the script. So we have these beautiful questions, and students will start an interview, and they'll start the interview, and then the person will give this amazing response, and they'll start to trail off a little bit, and then the student will just switch to the next question and not prompt them about all this amazing, really rich history that they just shared. So that is a common mistake, is that they just get zoned in on the script. They're zoomed in. They can't think about anything else. They don't think about prompting questions. So getting them to think about how to prompt is a really important skill. Two is not writing down notes. So if you've ever interviewed anybody, you know that people tend not to talk chronologically about the past. They start here, and then they go there, and then they go here, and then they go there, and then they're bouncing all over the place. And they're thinking about this story that related to this one time when, and this person that I knew. So those kind of thought processes can be really hard to track. And so what I recommend is as students start taking interviews, that they write down hard copy on a piece of paper notes that they can use to prompt themselves about questions they want to return to. And so that takes time, that takes practice. Usually, so when I worked with students in Cumberland, it took 3 tries. We did 3 interviews. By the third interview, they felt pretty good. They felt like they could use the notes. And then last, the other common mistake I see students do is interviewing in a busy space. So they'll go and they'll collect their interview and they're sitting in the lunchroom and you can hear like this one guy chewing cereal from like two tables down and someone shouting in the background and you don't get anything from the interview. So telling them that they need to find a public but somewhat quiet place where they can engage and that the person being interviewed feels comfortable. That's really important. Right. And if you're like, oh man, interviews, transcribing, I don't have time for any of this. My schedule is so tight. How can I get my students to engage with oral history? No problem. There are a few things that you can do to have students gain these benefits. And one of the things you could do is I did this multiple times. You can source your oral history interviews yourself. So instead of having students go out and collect the history, you go out, collect the history, you bring it to the classroom, and then they think about the history, they listen to the history, they transcribe, which gives them a completely different view on primary sources. So some strategies you can use. One, there are just a ton of oral histories hosted by the Library of Congress, a ton on every topic imaginable. So I linked into these slides a bunch of oral history about the civil rights movement, but you can find them about almost any topic. I was looking at some today about fisheries in Maine. They have oral histories about fisheries in Maine. So you can find them, I guarantee you. And bring them into the class, listen to them, have the students engage with that history. 2, let them transcribe. Transcription is a brutal, brutal process. It is so hard. You have to listen, you have to rewind. It's really frustrating, but it gives them a new appreciation, one, for what historians do, and two, they're really engaged in the historical work. They're thinking about the words that are being said because they have to listen to them over and over and over again. So let them transcribe a YouTube video or an already existing video or interview. And last but not least, I used to do this with my students all the time. We did a divide and conquer. So we'd get like a 20-minute oral history, and then I would give each person a minute they had to transcribe. And I'd give them like 15 minutes to do it because it would take that long. And by the end of that 15 minutes, everybody had contributed to this beautiful oral history that we'd created together. And they've contributed to the building of that narrative. And so you might be asking like, oh, Rory, you just, poo-pooed all the AI tools to make transcription super easy. What can I use? Well, you can use O-Transcribe. O-Transcribe is free. O-Transcribe is open source, so you know what's in the code. O-Transcribe doesn't sell anything that is transcribed because you do it all by hand and it's hosted locally on your Chromebook, on your laptop, on your iPad, whatever you're using. You could probably run O-Transcribe on it and it would work. So I have this QR code if you want to go to O-Transcribe, and I'm going to show you just how easy it is to use. So can we still see my screen? Tina, can we see my screen all right? Yes, excellent. So here's O-Transcribe. When you go to the website, it looks just like this. You can even load in a YouTube video. You want to choose audio. You can load in. So this is that oral history talking about rednecks. And then you can hit the play button and it will play the audio. And you can control the speed. Towards F3 is slower, towards F4 is faster. And then it even has this really nifty button that you can hit to give you a timestamp, no matter where the audio is. So that is swell. That is swell. And it's free and it works on Chromebooks for those of you that are using Chromebooks at home or with your students. All righty. That's O-Transcribe. All right, and the last bit, and arguably the most important, trust building. How do I contact potential participants? And there is no easy way to do this. One, it all comes down to who you know, who your kids know, and the trust that you've earned in the community. But you can rely on your kids for the most part. They've been part of your community oftentimes for a long time, and you can leverage their connections to help you. And oftentimes, as you start making these connections with participants, they're going to know other people who are going to be willing to talk to you about their experiences. And scholars have a fancy term for this type of sampling. We call it snowball sampling because it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it rolls into this huge community, right? But that is one way that you can reach out to participants in your community about oral history specific to that place. All right. And I think that's all I got. We flew through that partially because we didn't do the Mentimeter. But yeah, do I have any questions?
You can feel free to unmute or drop the question in the chat. Yes, they want to see your slide deck.
I have that QR code right there. Will take you to my slides. Need to make sure it's actually on share. It should be on share, right? Yes.
It is. I was able to access it. So,
Question:
yes.
Will this video and this Zoom be available for me to review at a later time? I'm one of those Gen Xers who like to watch things multiple times and transcribe myself.
Yes, we do have a YouTube channel. So I will put the link to the YouTube channel in there, and it will get loaded for tonight or tomorrow. So I'll get that in there for you. And you'll also be able to access all of the past ones too.
Awesome.
They're on YouTube, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I like learning, and my students either benefit or groan over it because they're like, oh gosh, you learned something else. It's like, oh, yeah, sorry.
So glad you liked it, Annie. So glad you came. It's been a minute since St. Louis, I think.
And Tina, if anyone in this webinar ever comes to Virginia, we will take you to the Moton Museum because it needs to be seen by everybody.
It is a fantastic
hidden gem.
It is
I love that.
Okay, you said in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
How close is it to, say, Harper's Ferry and in Maryland, et cetera? Is it in that area or center of the state?
It's center of the state. So Harper's Ferry is a good deal west.
Got it. Looking for places to go RV. So.
Yeah,
So link to the YouTube channel is in the chat. But we will also email this link directly out to everybody who registered for this webinar. We'll receive it in an email tomorrow after it's loaded to the YouTube channel. So there's a couple of different ways you'll be able to access it.
All right.
Any other questions for Rory?
And this is my contact information. If you want to email me, I love emailing people. So if you have questions about my method, about how I do this with students more, or logistical questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be happy to respond.
I'm thinking, Rory, just for myself, I'm working on a project with the history professor to craft biographies of veterans who are buried in veteran museums. So not cemeteries that there's two particular ones that we're focusing on right around the Kansas City area. And we've recently been talking about how can we capture some of the experiences of our veterans while they're still alive to help craft those biographies that can then be housed on the VA's website, where you can submit biographies and you can submit primary source documents to help demonstrate that you did that research. And so I see this as a really great way of getting kids maybe connected to their local VFWs and maybe connect with people for Veterans Day. And I think that the connection that the school has with the community would be a great way. When you were talking about building trust, if the school says, hey, we would love to have our kids connect and meet some of the veterans that are here in town and learn about their experiences and help craft these narratives, that could be a really great opportunity for them. So for me personally, this is really great timing because it gives us some real practical things that we could have teachers try. And it sounds like I'm thinking like even elementary aged kids could do this. It doesn't just have
Yeah.
to be older kids that are doing it.
The youngest I've done is sixth grade, but I would imagine, that you could have them listen in fifth grade and fourth grade, maybe have them engage with some small parts of transcription
Yeah.
for sure.
Question. What do you guys think of StoryCorps from NPR?
StoryCorps. I'll be honest, I'm not super familiar.
It's with Dave Isay, and usually a lot of them are oral histories given by people for different themes, and quite a few of them are very, very interesting.
I'm looking at their website now. It looks nice. Yeah, unfortunately, that's outside my lived experience, so I can't offer an endorsement or not. But I'll definitely check it out.
I'd say it's a good look.
Do you know
I
as
like.
a surprising amount of oral history is actually NOAA. NOAA has a huge repository of oral histories about a variety of environmental topics. So if you want to do a collaboration with like a science teacher about like how it affects, the environment or fisheries, they have a huge repository in almost every state. They have an oral history related to fisheries.
Yes. Here in Florida, Amelia Island has a pretty large, I think they have a vast amount of information at the Amelia Island Library. Museum. It's not a big museum, but they have oral historians throughout the museum giving you their version of what happened during the turn of the century with the shrimp fisheries, etc. So if anyone is ever in that area, it's like $5. You can't beat it.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. It took me a few hours to get through it. Well, I am very happy that I joined you and used an hour of my life. Unfortunately, I must depart.
Thank you for hopping in. I appreciate your presence here. You have a good night.
You too.
I am seeing, Rory, at the bottom of the StoryCorps page that major supporters and partners include the Library of Congress's American Folklife Center. So
There it is.
shout out to the Library of Congress for being a part of the StoryCorps project as well. That's awesome. Well, y'all, thank you so much for coming tonight. We have an intention of having a fifth webinar of our series, but it'll probably be after school starts back up in the fall. So by subscribing to our newsletter, you can get that information. Then tomorrow, I will send you an email with a link to this webinar, as well as a link to the newsletter if you didn't get signed up earlier. So that way you can get that information. And I just want to say, Rory, thank you so much for this. It was incredible. And to the rest of you, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you have a great evening.